Hey everyone, welcome back to another deep dive. Today we're going to be exploring the fascinating world of AI and how it tries to do something that all of us do, probably on a daily basis, and that is make sense of tons of different documents.
Right.
And I know that sounds pretty dry, but stick with us because it gets really interesting. We're going to be looking at those large language models. You know, the things that are behind chatbots, AI writers, and how they tackle the challenge of summarization.
And it can be a real challenge. You might be thinking that AI is getting really good at this stuff, and in some ways it is. But there's this paper that came out called From Single to Multi, How LLMs Hallucinate in Multi-Document Summarization. And it basically reveals that these LLMs sometimes get things really wrong. Like in some cases,
Yeah.
up to 75% of the content in their summaries was totally made up.
75%.
Yeah.
So you're telling me that these summaries, they're more like AI writing a fictional story than actually giving me the facts.
Yeah, sometimes it feels that way. The researchers, they actually found that these LLMs sometimes try to summarize topics that aren't even in the documents they're supposed to be looking at.
So it's like asking me to write a book report on a book that doesn't even exist.
Exactly.
But okay, so if these LLMs are making stuff up, how did the researchers even figure out what was real and what was totally fabricated?
So what they did was they focused on specific pieces of information. They called them insights. And they checked if these insights were actually mentioned in those original documents. That way they could really measure, like, how much of the summary was actually hallucinated.
So we've got AI that's prone to making stuff up. But what's really cool about this research is that they didn't just stop at, do LLMs hallucinate? They actually wanted to know how and where these hallucinations actually show up.
Yeah, and one of the first things they found was that what you're actually trying to summarize makes a big difference. They looked at news articles, which are usually pretty factual and straightforward,
Yeah.
and then they looked at conversations, which can be much more like all over the place.
Makes sense. Conversations are definitely way more complicated than just reading a news article.
And it turns out conversations were much harder for the LLMs. They were much more likely to hallucinate information when they were trying to summarize a conversation compared to just a news article.
And kids with all the back and forth in a conversation, maybe it just throws the AI off track.
Yeah, it's possible. They also tried something else interesting. They wanted to see if the LLMs did a better job if you told them to only summarize information that was mentioned in multiple documents, kind of like finding the common ground. They called this the subtopic plus shared setting.
So instead of trying to summarize everything, they're told to just focus on the points where multiple sources agree.
Exactly. But here's the weird part. Asking for this shared information often made the hallucinations even worse.
Wait, so you're telling me that by trying to narrow things down for the AI, by telling it just focus on the stuff that's mentioned multiple places, it actually made things worse?
Yeah, it was a pretty surprising finding. It kind of suggests that even when we try to simplify the task for these LLMs, they can still really struggle to just stick to the facts. And one of the most startling findings of this whole paper was that these LLMs would sometimes try to create summaries for topics that weren't even mentioned in the original documents.
Hold on. So even when there was absolutely nothing to summarize, that these LLMs were like, yeah, I got this. I can make something up.
Pretty much. And one model in particular, GPT 3.5 Turbo, tried to summarize this non-existent information almost 80% of the time.
That's kind of scary.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if you can trust any of these AI summaries. But were these hallucinations just randomly sprinkled throughout the summaries, or did the researchers find any kind of pattern?
That's where things get really interesting. They actually noticed a very clear pattern. The hallucinations tended to cluster towards the end of the summaries.
So like the ending of the summary was where all the made-up stuff ended up.
Exactly.
That is super weird. Why would that happen?
It's not entirely clear, but the researchers think it might have something to do with how these models are trained. They're trained to predict the next word in a sequence. So maybe as they go on, they kind of lose track of the original source material and start relying more on their own internal model of the world.
So if I'm reading an AI summary, I should be extra careful about those last few sentences.
Yeah, it's probably a good idea to be skeptical of the entire summary, but definitely pay attention to how things wrap up.
All of this is really fascinating, but it also raises a lot of questions, like what kinds of errors are these LLMs actually making? Are there like common patterns or categories?
That's a great question. And actually, the researchers dove into that as well.
Perfect. Well, let's take a quick break and then we'll come back and explore those different types of AI hallucinations. And we're back. Now, before the break, we were talking about how AI systems sometimes make stuff up when they're summarizing multiple documents. And you were saying that the researchers actually looked closer to see if there were any patterns in the types of errors that these LLMs were making.
Yeah, they found some really interesting patterns. And it's not just random mistakes. These errors actually tell us something about how these models are processing information.
Okay, so let's get into it. What's the first type of error?
So the first type they call pedantic, and it's basically when the LLM spits out a summary that is technically true, but it's like super obvious and not helpful at all. Like, imagine you asked an LLM to summarize the history of the Dodge demon, that muscle car,
Yeah.
and it just says, Dodge has a history of making powerful engines.
Okay, so it's not wrong, but it's also not exactly giving me any new information. It's like saying water is wet.
Exactly. It's like the
Yeah.
LLM is just picking up on those keywords that show up a lot, but it's not really getting the deeper meaning.
So it's more about mimicking the form of a summary than actually
Yeah.
summarizing the information.
Yeah, basically. And then the second type of error is called instruction inconsistency.
Hmm.
This is when the LLM includes information that's not really relevant to what you asked for. Like, let's say you ask for a summary of Twitter's algorithm changes, but then it starts going on about Twitter's revenue instead.
So it's like the LLM is following instructions, but not the right ones.
Yeah, it's like it got the topic wrong. It shows how important it is to be super clear with AI about what we want.
You can't be vague or leave any room for interpretation.
Exactly. And then there's the third type, which is called context inconsistency. This is where the LLM gets some details wrong, usually by like exaggerating or simplifying the original information.
It's kind of like that game of telephone where the message changes a little bit each time you pass it on.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a problem because what if you're relying on that summary to make an important decision?
Okay, so we've got pedantic, instruction inconsistency, and context inconsistency. What's the last one?
The last one is probably the most straightforward. It's called fabrication. And this is where the LLM just straight up makes up information that is not in the documents at all.
Why would it do that? Is it
Um,
trying to trick us?
I don't think it's being intentionally deceptive. It's more about these LLMs being prediction machines. They're always trying to guess what comes next based on what they've learned from their training data.
So in trying to create a story that makes sense, they sometimes fill in the gaps with their own guesses, even if it means going beyond the facts.
Exactly. And that raises some interesting questions about like what is truth and knowledge when AI is involved.
It gets pretty philosophical.
It does. But let's come back down to earth for a minute. If these LLMs are making all these mistakes, what does that mean for the future of AI? Are we headed towards a world full of misinformation and fake news? Not necessarily. These findings are definitely concerning, but they also help us understand how to make these models more reliable.
So there's hope. We don't have to abandon AI altogether.
Not at all. There are a lot of smart people working on this problem, and they're coming up with some really promising solutions.
Okay, so how do we fix these issues? Is
Yes.
there any way to actually get these AI hallucinations under control? So how do we fix these issues? Is there any way to actually get these AI hallucinations under control?
Well, the good news is there's a lot of research going on right now to try and make these models more reliable. And one of the biggest areas of focus is the data that these models are trained on.
Right, because you were saying earlier that these LLMs, they learn from huge amounts of text. And if that data is messed up, like it's biased or inaccurate,
Right.
then the model is going to learn those same bad habits.
Exactly. It's like garbage in, garbage out. So researchers are working on ways to clean up that training data, making sure it's as diverse and accurate as possible.
So it's all about making sure the AI has good examples to learn from. But even with perfect data, there's still the issue of how these LLMs are trained. You mentioned before that they're often trained to predict the next word in a sentence, which can sometimes lead to these hallucinations.
Right. They get so focused on creating something that sounds good that they kind of forget about being accurate. So researchers are also looking at different ways to train these models.
So instead of just focusing on predicting the next word, are there other things we can teach them?
Yeah, there are a lot of different approaches being explored. One idea is to train these models on tasks that require more than just predicting the next word. Things like reasoning, analyzing information, and fact-checking.
So it's less about being a smooth talker and more about being a critical thinker.
Exactly. We want AI that can evaluate the information it's given, not just spit out grammatically correct sentences.
But how do we know if these new training methods are actually working? How do we measure whether an LLM is really understanding the information and not just making stuff up?
That's a great question. And that's where evaluation comes in. Right now, we rely a lot on metrics that compare the LLM's output to the original text, but those metrics don't always capture the nuances of language.
So we need better ways to tell if an LLM is really getting it.
Exactly. Researchers are developing new evaluation methods that go beyond just matching words. They're trying to assess things like logical coherence, factual accuracy, and the ability to draw valid conclusions.
It sounds like there's a lot of work to be done, But it also sounds like there are a lot of smart people tackling this problem from different angles. Do you think we'll eventually get to a point where we can trust these AI systems?
I'm optimistic. I think every day we're learning more about how these models work and how they sometimes fail. And that knowledge is going to help us build better training methods, create better evaluation metrics, and ultimately develop more reliable AI.
So should we be excited about the future of AI or a little bit scared?
Honestly, I think it's a little bit of both. AI has the potential to revolutionize so many different fields and solve some really complex problems. But we also need to be aware of its limitations and use it responsibly.
So don't just believe everything an AI tells you. Always double check the information and remember that AI is a tool, a really powerful tool, but still a tool that needs to be used carefully.
Absolutely. The future of AI depends on us using it ethically and understanding both its potential and its limitations.
That's a great point. Well, I think that wraps up our deep dive into the world of AI hallucinations. It's a complex topic, but hopefully you learned something new today, and maybe you're even a little bit more curious about the future of AI. And that's what we're all about here. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive